Well, good morning, church. Good morning. How you doing? I like that new drum right there, bro. I might take that thing home and annoy Brittany with it, you know. Anyway, sorry. I loved it. I thought it was awesome. She would kill me. Anyway, thank you to everybody who's here, everybody who's watching online. We appreciate you so much. I'm excited. I'm excited to get into the second part of this series, and I'll just say this. If you did miss last week, I strongly recommend, just like Michelle, that you go back and you watch last week's message. We shared a lot of information and some very exciting things happening here at the church, and so it's important that you go back and listen to it. We began a series last week entitled Make a Way, where we began a study on the book of Nehemiah in the Old Testament. So if you want to read along, that's where we're going to be. We're going to be in Nehemiah chapter 2 today. But I want to take just a minute, if it's okay with you guys, to kind of catch you up on what we've learned so far, okay? I need to tell a little bit of what we talked about in Nehemiah chapter 1. As we pick up in chapter 1, Nehemiah was a Jewish man who was born into and living in exile in Babylon. He was an important servant to the king. Artaxerxes was his name. The people of Israel at this point in time in history had been scattered throughout the world following attacks, enslavement, and over 300 years of Babylonian rule. Everybody with me? I mean, this was a generational thing. Their promised land and their holy city, Jerusalem, lied in ruins. The walls were rubble. The gates were burned down. Many of the homes were burned down. In Nehemiah chapter 1, we discover that though some Jews had managed to return back to Jerusalem and were trying to live there, the conditions of the city were awful. People were living in poverty. They were living in hopelessness and squalor. Their life was very difficult. They were living unprotected still. When Nehemiah's brother returns from a trip to Jerusalem, that's what he tells Nehemiah. He tells him, he says, man, you're not going to believe how bad the situation is for our people who are living in Jerusalem. As a matter of fact, Nehemiah's brother said, it's disgraceful how people are living. It's humiliating that people are having to live this way. Do y'all remember that, church? Yes. Nehemiah was heartbroken when he heard this news. He was heartbroken. The Bible tells us that Nehemiah began to weep, and then he went into mourning, and then he fasted, and he prayed for the people. He prayed for the people of Israel. He was so greatly troubled by their plight, in fact, that he realized he was being called to do something. You remember that? He was being called to do something. He just couldn't stand by and let his people live the way they were having to live. So he realized he was being called to do something. And at the very end of chapter 1 last week, what we discovered is Nehemiah's, the last sentence of his prayer, he said this. He said, God, please grant me favor in front of the king. Make this king kind to me. Told us what? What, Ron? He's about to do something, wasn't he? Nehemiah was about to do something. This was the lesson last week. Everybody with me? Last week we learned that God calls us to big things. God calls us to big things. A consistent theme in God's Word, the Bible, when you read it, is it shows us that at some point in time in our life, if we're following God, that He is going to call us to some big things. He's going to so pierce our heart that He's calling us to do something that's far beyond ourselves. You with me? Even if it's difficult, even if it doesn't make any sense, even if it seems just too doggone big for us, God will call us to it. God calls us to big things. When people desire to follow God, it's just a matter of time before something appears in your life that so moves you, affects you to the point that you know God is calling you to do something about it. Are you with me? God calls us to big things. But that lends itself to a question, right? How do we accomplish big things? You with me? How do we accomplish big things? Y'all say that. Ask me that question. How do we accomplish big things? Ready? Go. I am so glad you asked. I am so glad you asked that question. To do that, you're not going to believe what I got to do.
Tell us a story.
I got to tell you a story. We got to continue our story if you want to. We're going to be in Nehemiah chapter 2, like I said. We're going to pick right back up with reading this together. Verse 1 says, early the following spring in the month of Nisan. Did you catch that? Early the following spring in the month of Nisan, during the 20th year of King Artaxerxes' reign, I was serving the king his wine. Little side note right here, something important for you to know. Nehemiah was actually serving, I told you he was an important servant. He was actually serving the king his wine. He was a cupbearer to the king. What does that tell us? That tells us that Nehemiah was someone who was pretty trustworthy as far as the king was concerned. He's making your drinks. You know what I'm talking about? Every once in a while, I send Andy to make me a drink. And she comes back, and she'll be going like that. And I'm like, oh, that was a bad idea. You trust the person who's making your drinks. You know what I mean? That's what you have to understand. As a king, this was a big deal. This was a big responsibility, and he was trusted with this. It tells us something about the relationship between Nehemiah and King Artaxerxes. But even more importantly, let me bounce back and point something out. It says, early in the following spring, in the month of Nisan. Now, this is something you just have to make sure that you catch is Nehemiah, we know, learned about this situation in November, December, because that's what we were told in chapter 1. So around November, December, Nehemiah hears about how bad things are in Jerusalem, and all the way here in chapter 2, we're in the month of Nisan. You know what month that is, Scott? It's April. It's April. So here we are in April. Everybody with me? Yes. All right, let's read verse 2. So the king asked me, why are you looking so sad? You don't look sick to me. You must be, what's the rest of it? Deeply troubled. You must be deeply troubled. We say, what's that? What's happening here? Apparently, the king finally picks up on Nehemiah is not quite right. The Nehemiah I know and love, who serves me and always seems to have a great attitude. I mean, I think that's something we can take from this. Always seems to be doing his job and just doing his job well. Something's not right about him. The king notices that something is off. And so the king asks and says, hey man, what's going on with you, brother? What's up? You're not yourself. What's going on? Read what it says. This is Nehemiah. It says, then I was terrified. You see that? Then I was terrified, but what did he do? I replied. That's important. I was terrified, but I replied. Long live the king. How can I not be sad? How can I not be sad? What are you saying? This matters to me. How can I not be sad? For the city where my ancestors are buried is in ruins, and the gates have been destroyed by fire. You understand, this is pretty bold to do this. You know who destroyed those walls? Babylonians. This is clear cut and dried. But Nehemiah, he just says what he's feeling. This is my heart. This is how I feel. My city, my people, it lies in ruins. And that breaks my heart. In verse 4, this is what it says. It says, the king asked, well, how can I help you? Oh, seems like a sign, don't it? Well, how can I help you? How can I change what's going on with you? Look at this very next phrase. With a prayer to God of heaven. With a prayer to the God of heaven. Are you with me? With a prayer to the God of heaven, I replied, if it please the king, and if you are pleased with me, your servant. In other words, and if I've done a good job, if we've got a good relationship, if I'm somebody that you trust, if you're pleased with me, your servant, then send me to Judah to rebuild the city where my ancestors are buried. Does that seem like a big ask for the cupbearer? Yeah. Send me to the city to rebuild it. To rebuild the city where my ancestors are buried. In verse 6, the king with the queen sitting beside him. I think that's important. Men, you shouldn't make decisions on your own. The queen sitting beside him. Here we go. Asked, how long will you be gone? When will you return? I want to pause. You know what I think that shows us? They didn't want to lose Nehemiah forever. He mattered to them. That tells us something about their relationship. You with me? After I told him how long I would be gone, so Nehemiah gives him some sort of estimate of time frame of what he's thinking this is going to take. It says, after I told him how long I would be gone, the king agreed to my request. Brady, come on. That's awesome. The king agreed to my request. The king said, sounds reasonable. That sounds good. You should go. Right? That's awesome. All of Nehemiah's prayers, all that mourning, all that fasting, all that praying, apparently it had worked. The king agrees to send Nehemiah to head up a rebuild operation in Jerusalem. He hears Nehemiah's heart and passion and signs off on the journey. I want to make sure you understand that's not an accident. This is a reach back to what he asked for in Nehemiah chapter 1 at the end. This is God's favor on him. Everybody with me? That's God's favor in action. The king agreed to something that sounds pretty crazy. That's God's favor. But man, Nehemiah don't stop there. He doesn't just stop with permission. I mean, as soon as he gets permission, Nehemiah goes, all right, well, let's see how this is going. Nehemiah begins to make some other requests of the king. Begins to ask for some other things. You can read it for yourself if you want to. I'm just going to outline them right here for you. First, he asked for letters for the provinces that he's going to travel through in order to get to Jerusalem. He has a long travel. He needs letters to the kings and the rulers of those provinces so that he can travel safely, so they won't attack him or rob him or kill him. He needs permission, and he asked for these letters from Artaxerxes. He also asked for a second thing. He asked for letters to the manager of the king's forest. So you understand, King Artaxerxes, he had land and had timber, and all of it was meant for just royal use. It was meant for just anything he deemed worthy. You understand? So Nehemiah says, hey, could you write a letter to the manager of the king's forest and make sure that he gets me all the materials that I need to rebuild these gates and rebuild these walls and also build some houses and stuff. I'm going to need a home while I'm there. And he just outlines all of these things that he needs. Are you with me? Would y'all say that's pretty bold? Yes. Seems just a minute ago he was terrified. Now all of a sudden he's willing to ask for all this stuff. Look what it says. It says, and the king granted these requests. But you can't miss it, because the gracious hand of God was on me. All of these things he asked for, all these details, all of these little things that he had thought of, that he had made a list of, that he knew he was going to have. The gracious hand of God was on me, and the king granted the request. That's pretty awesome, isn't it? We're not given a lot of insight into the preparation and all the things that have to happen, but I imagine this is a pretty major undertaking to get all of these things together, and the travel and all the material and everything. But we know that Nehemiah begins his journey pretty promptly. And then verse 9 it says this, when I came to the governors of the province west of the Euphrates River, I delivered the king's letter to them. So he's saying, he's giving these letters out that says, hey, please let me travel through safely and with all of these things that I'm headed to Jerusalem with. Then it says this, it says, the king, I should add, had sent along army officers and horsemen to protect me. What happened? Sounds like the king went a little above and beyond, doesn't it? King was like, I got another idea. It says, the king, I should add. Let's add this to it. He said, you're going to need some protection. I'm going to send some soldiers with you. I'm going to send some horsemen with you to protect me. And look how necessary it was. Look at verse 10. It says, but when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard of my arrival, they were displeased that someone had come to help the people of Israel. What did he come to do? Help these people. Nehemiah had come to help the people of Israel, and all of a sudden a pair of naysayers, a pair of enemies appears in our story. They're going to be with us throughout the book of Nehemiah. But Sanballat and Tobiah, I want to make sure you understand, they're neighbors, really close neighbors and enemies of the Jews. They haven't been acting like enemies right now because they didn't need to. The Jews in Jerusalem was no threat to them or their prosperity or anything. But now here comes this Nehemiah guy on some sort of mission. There's a lesson you got to see here, church. Opposition didn't appear for Nehemiah when his heart was broken. Opposition didn't occur in Nehemiah's life when he began to cry and mourn and fast. Enemies didn't pop up when Nehemiah was praying. As a matter of fact, enemies didn't even show up when he was talking to the king. But the second that Nehemiah showed up to do something, enemies were there. Y'all good with a little side life lesson? The doing phase is always met with opposition. The doing phase of big things is always met with opposition. When it comes time for things to be done, that's when people will typically protest and the enemies come out of the woodwork. You with me? That's just a little free one. That's a free one today. You're welcome. About halfway through chapter 2, we're told Nehemiah makes it to Jerusalem and he begins to head out to survey the wall. But we got to stop here today because there is a lesson that we are shown. And I'm telling you, this lesson must be first on our list of what it takes to accomplish big things. You ready? My note takers, are you ready? This one's worth writing down. In order to accomplish big things, this is the truth. God must be in charge. And kids this morning, they're teaching the same lesson, saying it a little different. They're saying, God makes a way. God has to be in the lead. God has to be the one clearing the path for you. God has to be the one in charge. You with me?
Yes.
When called to big things, we must recognize, first of all, who the call came from. I'm telling you, this will help you a lot. This will help you a lot at keeping God in charge and making sure that God's in charge. First off, you need to recognize who the call came from. Who called you to this big thing? Who made the call in our story, guys? God. With something like rebuilding the wall of Jerusalem, Nehemiah knew that the call came from God. And you say, well, how did he know? How did he just know that this call came from God? First off, he was so moved. He knew in just the way that it felt, the heart brokenness that he was experiencing, that he just knew in all of that time, that mourning and fasting and praying, all of the time he spent doing that, he knew that it came from God. But even more than that, guys, here's the truth. When you look at the facts surrounding the big thing, it's easy to see that it was a God thing. You with me? This was a huge undertaking for a man like him. This was a big ask. It was going to require sacrifice. Most likely, he wasn't really qualified. He wasn't the first choice of people to go back and do this. This big thing was selfless. It was a selfless act. It was going to help others. It was going to honor God. Are you with me? If you're looking at just like, how do you know this is from God? It checks all the boxes. It was going to require tremendous sacrifice. As a matter of fact, at certain points in time on this journey towards trying to accomplish this task, he's going to be in danger at certain points of it. All of the circumstances surrounding this big thing point to the fact that it is God's call. It's scary. It's not easy. It's selfless. It's probably God. You with me? But Nehemiah, I'm telling you, all of those facts and all of that time that Nehemiah spent, he knew it was from God. He knew this call was from God. Therefore, he knew God needed to be the one in charge of every single step and everything that happened along the way. Are you with me? Same goes for us. When we confirm and we know that God has placed this big thing on our heart and we know we have to do something, we must make certain that God is the one calling the shots. We must make certain that if we know this is a God mission, then we must make sure that He's the one in the driver's seat all the way. It's up to us to make sure that God is the one in control throughout an endeavor like this. This should lend itself to another question. Well, then wasn't God in charge of? What specific things do we need to make sure He's in charge of? Now, y'all know what the easy preacher answer is? Everything. But actually, if you're willing to take a step back and look in our story, you will see that God actually gave us a list of some things that He'd like to be in charge of. Can I show them to you this morning? I got 4 things. 4 things that you have to make sure God is in charge of if you want to accomplish big things. Are you ready?
Yes.
Are you ready, church?
Yes.
All right, here's your list. Number 1, you ready? The timing. Man, you want to accomplish big things, you better make sure God is in charge of the timing. I mentioned this when I was sharing the story with you, but in Nehemiah chapter 1, we're told Nehemiah hears about the conditions, right? He hears about what's going on in Jerusalem, and we know that it's somewhere around November or December because it told us in chapter 1. His prayer shortly after, that prayer right at the end of chapter 1, this is what it says. It says, "Please grant me success today by making the king favorable to me. Put it in his heart to be kind to me." When does Nehemiah foresee, when does he think this conversation is going to happen with the king? Today. He is expecting this conversation to happen soon for sure. Would you say soon?
Yes.
He's expecting it to happen soon. However, when you look at the beginning of chapter 2, it says in the month of Nisan, which is April, when they finally have a conversation. Do you mean to tell me that this calling on Nehemiah's heart sat for 5 or 6 months before he ever had a conversation about it? Yes. Yes, it did. You say, why? Why did it take so long before they had a conversation? This is what I'm guessing. At some point in all that fasting and all that praying, Nehemiah said these words, "God, I want you to be in charge of the timing. I am looking for you to create an opportunity for me to have a conversation with the king." Are you with me? I don't know if it was an epiphany. I don't know if it was just a part of Nehemiah's walk. It was just the kind of man that he was, the way that he followed God. But he placed God in charge of the timing. I believe, as we often are meant to do, that he said, "I'm going to wait on you, God, to give me an opportunity to talk to the king." Nehemiah wanted to see an open door. Isn't that right, Teresa? He wanted to see an open door. He wanted God to show up and just kick that door wide open. And how did he do so? The king went, "You're not right, Nehemiah. What is troubling you?" Doors open. You with me? Nehemiah knew it's time. It's time. Second thing God has to be in charge of in order to accomplish big things. You ready? Relationships. God has to be in charge of the way we conduct our relationships. One thing about big undertakings, one thing about big things is big things typically require a lot of other people. Big things typically require a lot of other people, a lot of talking, a lot of conversations, and a lot of relationships. Are you with me? These relationships must be handled with God at the helm. We have to be living for God in the context of all of our relationships in order for God to be in charge. When Nehemiah begins his conversation with the king, as we're revealed a little bit about their relationship, tell you what you can tell. They had a strong relationship. The king cared enough to ask. Nehemiah had conducted him in such a way that when something was really wrong with him, the king eventually noticed. You with me? Their relationship was strong. When Nehemiah begins his conversation, he shares with us, "I was terrified." Do you know why? Because he's wondering, how's the king going to take this? What's he going to say or do? You understand, in those days, this was a big deal. To say these kind of things to the king, this was a huge deal. This could have went south real quick. You understand what I'm saying? If anything that Nehemiah said was misconstrued or appeared aggressive or was a little blaming towards the Babylonians, this could have ended in, you know what I'm saying? If anything had become twisted or misdirected, it could have caused difficulty, dissension in their relationship. It could have halted any forward movement. You understand? God had to be in control of the relationship. As a matter of fact, there's a little note in there that I think is important. It says, when the king asked, the king said, "Well, how can I help?" Well, how can I help? There's that open door. Well, how can I help? It said, the very next verse says this, "With a prayer to the God of heaven, I replied." You got to understand, Nehemiah hadn't just spent months already praying about this relationship and this favor that he needed from the king. But right there in the middle of this conversation, right there in the middle of this relationship, Nehemiah is going, God, help me speak to this man. Help me talk to him. You got to understand, God was there and engaged in this. And it was the favor. It was the favor that Nehemiah saw. He knew, God's with me. God is using this relationship to get me where I need to be. You with me? Yes. All right, number 3. You ready, church? Yes. God has to be in charge of the particulars in order to accomplish big things. Y'all know what the particulars are? That's a southern way of saying the specifics, the details, okay? The particulars, you know. You don't pronounce it exactly right. You just say it. That's the word I love to use. God's got to be in charge of the particulars. One thing we mentioned last week when talking about big things is there's always a lot of tiny details. Nehemiah, for instance, is going to have a route to Jerusalem. He was going to have letters for safe passage for multiple governors. He had need of a lot of materials, lumber and different things from the king's forest and everything that he was going to need to build these gates back and to build these walls and to build some homes and his own home. I mean, all of these things. He had a whole list of details. I want you to read with me how the Bible describes these provisions came to be. This is straight out of the Scripture. Look at me. This is how all these little details came to be. Look, it said, and the king granted these requests because the gracious hand of God was on me. Who provided the details then? God. Who took care of the particulars? God did. When it comes to big things, the tiny details matter. So God's gracious hand better be visible as you head into these big things, as you deal with these tiny details. Are you with me? God's gracious hand better. This is what I mean. If there is an element or something that you're looking for, and when you're heading out trying to accomplish this big thing that God's called you to, and there is an element that is not there that you were counting on, okay? If there is a need that you were like, oh, we're really going to need this to happen, and that need is unmet, when there's this particular thing that's not working out, or there's this detail that is just you were counting on, and it's going to be a no-go. You best start asking yourself if God is in this thing at all. Does that make sense? Yes. You better make sure that you are willing to ask that, because I'm telling you something. When God's gracious hand is involved, the details get worked out. The particulars are taken care of. Are you with me? God has to be in charge of the particulars. Number 4, last one. You ready, church? Yes. God's got to be in charge of the extras. He's got to be in charge of the extras. Trust me, you're going to want God in charge of the extras. When God calls us to big things, and you're out there, man, and you're answering the call, and you're doing the work, and you've got the relationships, and all these things are happening, I'm telling you, go ahead and in your mind, just go ahead and say, God, I want you to take care of all the things I didn't think of. Whatever I didn't see. God, I want you to go ahead and take care of that. Just say, God, I've planned, I've requested, I've shared my thoughts. Now, you do whatever else you think should happen. You take care of whatever needs to happen. You got it. Remember our story? Remember that verse? The king, I should add, had sent along army officers and horsemen to protect me. That's something Nehemiah didn't plan for, Jim. That's something Nehemiah didn't ask for. That's probably something Nehemiah didn't even think was an option, Chris. You with me? You realize the very next verse in that story, what it tells us? It tells us that Sanballat and Tobiah, these enemies, show up. And what does it say about them? It says they were displeased. You know what it says they did? Not a darn thing. Do you know why? Can I say that? Is that okay? You know why? Because they were horsemen and soldiers. God had protected Nehemiah, so all they could do was just grumble and not do a thing. You with me? God took care of the extras. He was in charge of the extras. The things Nehemiah couldn't see, the things that Nehemiah couldn't predict, and he couldn't plan for. God was in charge. God needs to be in charge of the extras in our lives. When we pursue these big things that God has called us to, make sure He knows that you know that you don't see it all and you don't know it all. You with me? When God calls you to big things, make sure He is in complete charge. Make sure He is completely in charge. But to name a few things, make sure He's in charge of the timing. Make sure He's in charge of the relationships. Make sure He's in charge of the particulars. And make sure He's in charge of the extras. You with me? Last week we shared a huge thing we feel God is calling Golden Corner Church to. We have been called to help more and more people find Jesus. You understand? We're meant to help people all over the county and this world find what they are looking for, and we believe with all of our hearts that everything anybody is looking for is found in the person of Jesus Christ. Am I right, church? Yes. To accomplish that, the leadership of this church feels it's time to expand and maximize our current space. We shared that with you last week. We shared the plans for phase 1 with you. We shared some of the financials and most of the information that you would need to understand how big of an undertaking this is for our church. The leadership spent the last 2 years praying and planning on the best way to tackle this, okay? We've done that. But now we've issued a call to you. And over, I think it's next 14 days now, started at 21, but over the next 14 days, we've asked you to do something. We've asked you to pray over your church, over the ministries of this church, and the things with gratitude and with a sense of urgency over just what God has called us to. We want you to pray about that, but we also wanted you to pray about if and how God would have you contribute to this. And I encourage you to go back and listen to that. But May 5th, like Michelle said earlier, you're going to have an opportunity to do that. You're going to have an opportunity, if God so leads you, to come and bring a first fruits offering, a proportion of it, and commit over the next 3 years to give beyond your normal giving. You're going to have that opportunity. But I want to make sure you know something. That's between you and God. But we know something we're going to do. We're going to make sure God's in charge of everything we do. We're going to make sure God's in charge of the timing. You know what people have asked me relentlessly? So when you think we're going to break ground? When you think it's going to happen? How long do you think it's going to take? I don't know. Is that okay for me to say? I don't know what God's going to do yet. I don't know what God's going to do through you guys and us. I don't know what He's going to do. I am completely placing that in His hand and saying, God, you're in charge of the timing. Are we prepared to start immediately if everything we're just blown away? Absolutely we are. We're prepared to do that. But I want to tell you something. We're only walking through the door that God opens. And we'll know. It'll be a Nehemiah moment for us. We'll know, we'll see that God has opened that door and it is time. God's in charge of the timing, and we are completely comfortable with that happening whenever it's supposed to happen. You with me? God's in charge of the relationships that we have here. First off, God's been in charge of the relationships between your staff and your trustees and all these decisions that we've had to make. We've prayed and talked about all of these things, all these little decisions that we've had to make just up until now. I want to tell you, He's been a part of those relationships. But even more so than that, there are other relationships that happen because of that, right? Other questions that I've been asked is like about the builder or about the banks or about our architects and all these things. I want to tell you something. From the get-go, we've made sure that God was in charge of these relationships. We're making sure that our architects understand the mission and who it is, who we are, and what we feel like God has called us to. And the mission is above a building. You understand? We've made sure they've seen our heart and our passion. It's going to be that way in every aspect of this. And I want to tell you what we're looking for in these relationships. We're looking for favor. When it comes to a bank or it comes to construction, we're looking for understanding of the mission and favor of what we've been called to do. You understand? That's how we're going to make those decisions. God's going to be in charge of those relationships. You know what else God's going to be in charge of? He's going to be in charge of the particulars. You realize how many details there are associated with this thing? I've been asked relentlessly, so what interest rate are y'all thinking? We don't know. Probably the lowest one we can get. You know, how much money do you think we're going to loan? There are all sorts of details that we know. I mean, guys, there are so many details to these decisions that we're going to have to make over the next several months. So many decisions. I'm going to tell you what we're looking. We're looking for God's gracious hand to be in the details. Isn't that what our scripture said? We're going to be looking for God's gracious hand to be in the details. We will know. We will see right there. We needed that, and it's there. That element we're looking for is there. That must-have, it's there. We're going to be looking for the details that are obviously God. We're looking for God's gracious hand. I'll tell you this too. God's going to be in charge of the extras, Josh. Because here's what I know. We don't know near what we think we know. And God knows it all. And we have prayed to Him and said, I wish you knew. Honestly, I wish you knew how many times I'm in the midst of all of this work and all these things, I stop and go, I don't know. Whatever you want to do, if there's extra things we need, if there's something I'm not seeing, I hope you know I'm just trusting you with it. So if you could not let me screw this up, that would be great. Do you know how often? I pray that all the time. I'll just be like, the kids will be talking about something, and I'll kind of zone out for a second. I'll say, God, I really hope that anything that I'm not thinking of or seeing, you'll take care of it. I'm trusting you to do that. God's going to be in charge of the extras. You know what I'm saying? That is our goal. No matter what happens, I ask you to do exactly the same thing that you did last week. Pray all week. Walk through it with us if you can on social media. Hopefully you have that card. Pray with us. And no matter what, help us make sure that God is in charge of it all. God's going to be in charge of the timing, the relationships, the particulars, and the extras, and much more here at Golden Corner Church. You with me?
Yes.
Let me pray for you. God, I thank you for this church. I thank you for each and every person that is here, and I thank you for the mission that you have set before us, this big thing. It is exciting, and I'm thankful for it. I'm thankful for the opportunity to just be a part of it and see and witness, God, what you're doing. I wish often that people in our church got to hear all the things I get to hear, the conversations that I get to have, the people whose lives are changing. Just before service, a young man who was struggling came a couple of weeks ago, came walking up to me, and I said, how are you doing? He said, man, I'm doing good. And I know the reason is because you're working, you're moving, and you're working in his life. You're igniting joy in him again. You're giving him strength. And God, I just get to hear stuff like that so often. And that's what it's all about. Everything else, all of this other stuff, God, is a means to an end. It is an opportunity for us to put Jesus in front of somebody and say, listen, this is who you really need. And so, God, I pray this. I pray we will respond as you would have us respond. I pray that you will give us courage. I pray that you will lead us as each one of us has to decide about how we move forward and what we do and how we sacrifice and all those things. And God, I pray at the end of it, we go, my goodness. Look what our God did. That's what I pray. Be with everyone here, and I pray this as you call them to big things in life. As you call them to do something far beyond what they ever thought they could. This is my prayer. God, I pray they'll put you in charge of everything, of every step, because then I know you will make a way and you will make their way straight. In Jesus' name, everybody says, amen. I love you, church. I hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next Sunday. Bye-bye.